Giulia Rocca is a PhD student at the University of Ljubljana. Her research project deals with the question of the subaltern class as the subject of history, with reference to Gramsci, post-colonial studies, and Walter Benjamin. More generally, her scientific interests include German classical philosophy, particularly Kant and Hegel, and the questions of the autonomy of thought and its historical dimension, and is, of course, also the prime mover of this conference. Now, Giulia, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So, in this talk, I'm going to deal with the question whether Walter Benjamin's historical materialism, in particular its demystification of capitalism and its concept of history, can offer a conceptual framework to meet the challenge of the project of subaltern studies, that is, to think the vindication of the past as a condition for the emancipation of subaltern classes. The need to pose this question emerges insofar as subaltern studies fail to accomplish their own program. Indeed, my claim is that, though criticizing elite historiography, and the nationalist one in particular, they cannot develop an alternative to it, thus ending up repeating what they initially criticized. We need a conceptual turn in the thinking of history, as emerged before. It goes without saying, I do not attempt, as I hope it is clear, to undermine the importance of anti-colonial struggle for independence. My aim is rather to critically underline that within the framework of strategical anti-colonial nationalism, the question of emancipation of the subaltern classes risks to go lost and subordination to be established anew. So, the project of subaltern studies was born with the aim of vindicating the history of Indian subaltern classes. The latter, understood as the inferior, non-dominant classes, mainly the peasantry, are subaltern insofar as their agency as historical subject is not recognized. Rather, it is obliterated in the colonial as well as indigenous elitist historical records and narratives. From this point of view, the Subaltern Studies group is very critical of nationalist historiography, which is part of that elitist movement. In all his writing, Rajani Gua notoriously denounces Indian national historiography of being elitist, not at the service of subaltern classes. And yet, in Dominance Without Hegemony, he also outlines the program of an Indian historiography of India as the condition for restoring the agency of the colonized Indian people against colonial historiography, by taking reference to what he calls Bankim Chandra's agenda. The latter is namely the historiographical project of the 19th century Indian intellectual Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, who calls for the Indians, or more precisely only the Hindus, to write their own history. This historiography, written actually by Bankim Chandra himself, turns out to be an apology of the greatness of the Hindu empire, its origin and its past, with the exclusion of the Muslim component of the Indian population, whose aim is to show the Hindu strength and capacity for domination. Such a narrative, moreover, is linked to Bankim Chandra's Hindu nationalist elitist project of independence, an elitism that goes so far as to compare the relationship within the intellectual elite and the masses with the term subordination, echoing the one that designed the respect towards the colonial authority. Partha Chatterjee, on his turn, despite showing in his books that Indian national movement for independence did not produce any emancipation of the subaltern classes and reproduced instead a patriarchal struggle, oppression and subordination under a regime of passive revolution, still holds anti-colonial strategical nationalism for value. This impossibility of taking distance from the nationalist project, even when acknowledging that it damages the cause of the subaltern classes, is due to the fact that subalternists do not get rid of some of theoretical assumptions which they share with nationalism. On the one hand, the concept of Indian subaltern classes is made collapse with that of Indian colonized people. Secondly, the function of mediation in the development of class consciousness of the subaltern social groups, which Gramsci attributes to the organic intellectuals, turns into the representative role of the intellectual elite, which should mobilize the masses to act for the elite movement. In the first place, in Gua's initial statement of the program of Subaltern Studies, Indian subaltern classes, mainly the peasantry, are defined by difference from the dominant classes, composed both of the British colonizers and the indigenous elite. In this sense, the designation of the subaltern classes as the people was close to the Gramscian use of the concept of people, which refers to non-dominant classes. This definition, however, undergoes a shift, and the people ends up indicating the Indian people as a whole. This follows from the assumption of the condition of colonization as a peculiar condition of subordination. So the opposition of subaltern colonized classes on the one hand and the dominant classes, which included colonizers and the indigenous elite, shifts into the opposition of the colonized and subaltern insofar as it is colonized people as a whole, and the colonizers' people as a whole colonizing country. This change of perspective on the conflict is not without consequences. On the one hand, it faces class difference within the so-called Indian people. On the other hand, it prevents from considering the subaltern classes and the subaltern working class and peasantry in the colonizing countries, the analogy. The emancipation of subaltern colonized classes come to be subsumed under the struggle for independence of the colonized people as a nation, and the possible alliance with other subaltern groups in the colonizing country is undermined. Concerning the second point, moreover, within this project, the intellectual elite claims to represent the masses. That is, the political program for national independence also speak for the subaltern classes, meet their needs. This is the claim. Though underlining that it is in fact not the case, subalternists do not question the very function attributed to the intellectuals. If they had to be organic to the subaltern classes, so they should be the organ, the instrument through which the basis of the subaltern classes raise to class consciousness and constitute themselves as a political subject, thus acquiring agency. On the contrary, if those bases of the subaltern classes are represented, they do not become autonomous themselves. They only count as masses, that is, people mobilized by other dominant classes. The shift from an organic to a representative function of the intellectuals also transforms the meaning of hegemony, which disappears as a strategy of emancipation. The Gramscian term hegemony indicates either the leadership in the struggle for power or civil hegemony, that is, the administration of the consent by the dominant class. However, the hegemony of the leading class does not consist in gaining the support of the lower classes by convincing them that its ideology also represents them. As Peter Thomas points out, hegemony cannot be based on concessions to or conviction of the inferior classes, because this would lead only to the point where the class interest of the hegemonic class and of the allied classes would be incompatible, and the leading would betray the subaltern ones for the sake of its own existence as a class, as in the case of the Jacobins with the Parisian urban proletariat during the French Revolution. The only proper realization of the concept of hegemony, according to Gramsci, is the construction of an autonomous political subject with a shared interest for emancipation. Subalternists thus fail as organic intellectuals in their task of developing an alternative, revolutionary conception of the world. They are still caught within the nationalist paradigm. Their model remains the nation-state. This is strikingly evident in Chatterjee's claim for anti-colonial strategic nationalism. As a consequence, the conflict revolves around the independence of the nation as a nation, not the autonomy of subaltern colonized classes. This latter question is subsumed under the former, which is thought as its condition, but de facto it vanishes. And the establishment of a nation-state in the form of a nation-state cannot but reproduce subordination. It is the repetition of the same form with no alternative. According to Chatterjee, the decolonizing function of anti-colonial nationalism would consist in expressing the specific cultural difference of Eastern countries, instead of being emulative of a Western colonizing form of the state. Thus, Charterjee himself remains caught within the Orientalist distinction of a Western and an Eastern essence. He assumes that the form of nationalism and the nation-state historically taken by Western countries expresses a supposedly Western essence. Colonized countries, on their turn, would have the right to their own form of nationalism. In this argument, however, nationalism is never put into question as the political form of a specific organization of the relations of production, the capitalist one, which as such and not as specific Western produces colonization as well as subordination. From this point of view, it's not that nationalism fails in producing the emancipation of the subaltern classes, as the subalternists argue, because this was never its goal. Instead, it succeeds in the reproducing of subordination. As Epifanio San Juan puts it, from a historical materialist perspective, the post-colonial state can only reproduce, in this sense, the general condition needed to perpetuate the unequal property-power relation in their effects. Given this scenario, my question is, can Walter Benjamin's historical materialism help develop the concept of a history of the subaltern classes, meeting the challenges and the needs emerged with the failed project of the Subaltern Studies? I will try to reply affirmatively. My claim is not that Benjamin's historical materialism is as such the solution for a history of the subaltern classes. What I'm arguing is rather that his reflection on the concept of history and his critique of capitalism help address the two impasses in which the subalternist project got stuck. Firstly, thinking of vindication of the past of the subaltern classes, which could be constitutive part of their process of emancipation. Secondly, thinking the role of the intellectual in such a way that they could actually be organic instruments that serve the cause of emancipation. Due to the limited time here, however, the answer I'm sketching the following only develops one of these issues, namely the problem of what concept of history we need to think an emancipative vindication of the past. Firstly, Benjamin's project of the Passagenwerk as the dissolution of the mythology of capitalism into history provides us the theoretical tools not only for a critique of capitalism and of its narrative of progress, but also to undo any historical narrative which turns the historical dimension into a semblance of nature as essence. Benjamin's operation of this demystification can thus also demystify the reappropriation of the past in the narratives of strategic nationalism. Secondly, on the other hand, Benjamin's conception of history develops an alternative way of thinking the reappropriation, one which has an emancipating potential. So, to begin with, Benjamin's critique of capitalism as a myth or religion can also be regarded as the analysis of how the establishment of this myth produces the subordination of the oppressed class. A subordination which is here to be understood in its double sense, both as the misrecognition of agency of the oppressed class, as claimed by the Subaltern Studies, and in a more Gramscian way, as depriving this class of the very possibility of organizing itself as the struggling oppressed class, in Benjamin's word, that is a collective political subject able to act autonomously. Concerning this latter aspect, Benjamin serves of the metaphor of the state of dream to indicate the perception of the world of the subaltern social groups, which prevents them from developing class consciousness. The state of dream is the perception of the world resulting from capitalism, which, once established as the hegemonic image of the world, becomes a religion, a cultus. The commodity form, that is a social convention, comes to be perceived as the immanent form of things, so as an unchangeable, eternal, and necessary law. It is a fetish, so a myth. Capitalism imposes itself as a narrative which hypostatizes a historical form into a supposed nature, a natural, eternal origin. As such, the law of the market seems to transcend any human power. In their commodity form, things do not show their own making, their origin in human labor and construction, nor they show to be transient and short-lived, doomed to be replaced by new and yet the same stuff, just powering the cycle. On the contrary, the things of every day as commodities are endowed with an illusory glitter and aura. The word of capital is thus a re-enchanted word which overlays everything with a spell promising novelty. This is responsible for the continuous maintenance of this attraction for commodities and produces alienation of the individual from his/her own product and from the other individual. The oppressed class, completely absorbing this image of the world and completely absorbed within it, is prey of this myth in which it lives as in a phantasmagoria. It aims at conforming to it to keep pace to the induced need of consumption. This undermines the possibility for a self-organization of the oppressed class into a struggling subject, and it has a narcotic effect, as Benjamin says. The phantasmagoria keeps the proletariat in the unawareness of itself as a class. Every oppressed lives its dream in an individualized experience, isolated as an anonymous component of the crowd. With regard to the meaning of subordination given by Subaltern Studies, on the other hand, so as misrecognition of agency, also the historical narrative produced by the dominant culture, according to Benjamin, is immersed in this mythical dimension. History is reified into a continuous progress. Likewise, in Subaltern Studies, Benjamin's point is that the dominant narrative of progress does not recognize the oppressed class as historical subject, trying to obliterate its action. One of the famous quotes of Benjamin, whoever has emerged victorious participates to this day in the triumphal procession in which current rules step over those who are lying prostrate, from Thesis 7. Since they are not victorious, since they did not establish themselves as dominant, they do not find place in the narrative. They are the silenced voice in history. Their contribution to the building of human history and culture is not recognized. The building of human knowledge and culture hides indeed a history of violence, of exploitation of the work of people, of dispossession or destruction of other culture. And here comes another famous quotation. Whatever the historical materialist surveys in art or science has, without exception, a lineage he cannot observe without horror. The products of art and science owe of their existence not merely to the effort of the great genius who created them, but also, in one degree or another, to the anonymous toil of their contemporaries. There is no document of culture which is not at the same time a document of barbarism. As a consequence, the efforts to break the chain of oppression, to divert the course of history, are obliterated by the great narrative, which presents history as the linear development leading to the enthronement of the present dominant class. That which does not fit into this scheme is either let fall out, apparently condemned to oblivion, or weakened in its historical subversive meaning, and absorbed, made homogeneous to the narrative. So says Benjamin, the enshrinement or apologia is meant to cover up the revolutionary moments in the occurrence of history. At Earth, it seeks the establishment of a continuity. It sets store only by those elements of a work that have already emerged and played a part in its reception. The places where tradition breaks off, hence its peaks and crags, which offer footing to one who would cross over them, it misses. The present is hypostatized into the necessary result of the triumphal march of the dominant class. The past, or better what remains of the past after that revolutionary forces have been either cancelled from or made homogeneous to the current narrative, is reified into the dead object of contemplative study. The past would have already developed its result into the present. It would be an already exhausted source from which nothing new can spring. Consequently, future, as the authentic possibility of something new, is cancelled. The question is therefore how to produce an awakening from the state of dream which could turn the oppressed class into a conscious subject of the construction of history. The question indeed sounds very Gramscian. how to act on the superstructure at the level of which consciousness of structure is produced in order to enact a transformation of the structure itself. The myth which produces the phantasmagoria must be dissolved, or to use Benjamin's famous expression, the kaleidoscope must be smashed. In the fragments of the Passagenwerk, Benjamin declares the program of dissolving mythology into the space of history. How is this dissolution of the myth into history to be understood? The opposition between myth and history is here not simply the opposition between a tale and human happenings as facts, nor between something that is fixed in the past and something which develops. Rather, myth is the narrative which makes an image of the world appear as natural, necessary, and eternal, thus subtracting it to human power. In this sense, as seen, history itself, or better the historicist account of progress, of capitalism, is a myth. The mystification must therefore consist of the operation of showing the non-continuity of history, the non-eternal character of the relations of production structural to capitalism. Historical material means as to dissipate the semblance of eternal sameness and even of repetition in history, says Benjamin. To this aim, Benjamin's effort in the Passagenwerk is to make a natural history of capitalism. It is worth to dwell on the concept of natural history. In the Passagenwerk, Benjamin serves of this concept, which has been developing since his early period, of course, and employs it in all its critical potential against the myth of capitalism. Natural history turns the supposed nature into history, thus at the same time destroying from within the natural, thus mythical, illusionary accounts both of nature and of history. Nature takes the form of a myth when conceived as the natural. What is historical by habits and repetition takes the semblance of nature, of sameness, of eternal repetition from which one cannot escape. In the very case of capitalism, things and human relations take the form of commodity. History takes the form of progress. History, however, is neither simply the passing of time exterior to things, nor a continuous deterministic progress. History is the passing of time in the allegedly natural, its modification and transformation, so the discontinuous becoming of things, or their natural life. Natural history thus presents nature as transformation. Showing the transformation means bringing to evidence the points of discontinuity, of decay and interruption, and of reorigination. Since everything can acquire the semblance of nature, natural history is the critique of what has established itself as an alleged original. Hence, the natural history of capitalism is the critique of the myth of capitalism. Now, what Benjamin opposes to the semblance of eternity is the concept of origin. This indicates the origination of a constellation that is the point of departure and of unification of the articulation of an idea, an image of the world. Origin, therefore, does not indicate a genesis, as Benjamin says, the process out of which something would result as its consequence, but it is rather what marks the caesura of a new beginning. As such, it separates a prehistory and a post-history. The former, the history preceding the origin, is the historical presupposition of its coming into being. The latter is the constellation to which the origin gives life and that then articulates. Natural history thus makes explicit the historically discontinuous dimension of the origin. It shows how it gives birth to something new, differentiating a previous and an after. It posits a discontinuity. Demystifying the myth of capitalism, therefore, consists in showing that supposed natural as a natural history as something that is not original and instead an origin, a historical origin, the origination and articulation of an image of the world. My point is that Benjamin's critique of the myth is not only a critique of capitalism, but it implies the task of a permanent critique. Against any narrative which reifies history into nature, nature must be shown as history. Against any myth of the original, the origin must be shown as the caesura. This demand of permanent critique would indeed satisfy Gramsci's requirement for hegemony as emancipating process in the form of democratic centralism, in which the structure created by the revolutionary force must be always anew subsumed to critique in order not to let it crystallize into a fixed structure which would no longer meet the real needs of the subaltern classes. However, Benjamin's critique goes further. His plea for struggle against reification does not only fight the fossilization of the structure, but it aims to avoid that the superstructure itself, as the constellation or image of the world which expresses the structure, comes to be assumed passively as a religion. Gramsci's theory, on the contrary, is weaker in this point. It does not offer any strategy against the turning of the shared revolutionary common sense, which he defines a myth echoing Sorel, into a passively assumed belief. Benjamin's theory, therefore, offers a model to contrast not only the religion of capitalism, but also all those narratives which, despite their claim to be emancipatory, just impose another myth of the original. The rapture of the origin, however, cannot become explicit through a discursivity which would remain caught within the logic of continuity. Instead, a dialectical exposition of the origin must break the supposedly natural chain of continuity. More precisely, the immediacy with which, in a judgment, the predicate is attributed to the subject must be put into question. And that which can break this immediate flow is the production of a shock effect. This should break the enchantment, the loop of the return of the same, thus causing the awakening from the state of dream. History would thus be recovered, first of all, in the sense of recovering the possibility of considering history differently. By dissolving the semblance of eternity, the shock effect also breaks the past free from the contemplative, petrifying gaze that imprisoned it as a dead object into the continuum. It is what Benjamin calls the Copernican revolution in historical perception. And he says, formerly it was thought that a fixed point had been found in what has been, and one saw the present engaged in the tentatively concentrating the forces of knowledge on this ground. Now this relation is to be overturned, and what has been is to become the dialectical reversal, the flash of awakened consciousness. Politics attains primacy over history. In the polarization of prehistory and posthistory, which brings the continuous flowing to a standstill, moments of the past flash up, now knowable, readable in a different way. Revolutionary past moments can be recovered from the oblivion and homogenization in which the myth of progress buries them. The index they bear as a sign of the possibility of a different course of history is now visible. As such, they become properly historical. Indeed, a moment is properly historical not because it is fixed as an element in the chain of the development of history. Rather, it becomes historical insofar as it is made free in its power of making history. However, as seen, it is not about constructing another narrative, another continuum, which should replace the present one. Demystifying the myth of progress must not fall back in the creation of another myth. Vindication of the past is not the recovery of an original past in the sense of origin as a myth that should be reestablished in the present. Quite the opposite, vindicating the past means to turn immobility into appropriation of the moment of action, thus reactivating and realizing the lost, abandoned possibility of emancipation. It's not about writing yet another narrative of what should be considered the original, but to make another origin real. Revolution, writes Benjamin, is a leap, a sprung, or better, an ursprung, an origin, a leap out of which a new word can be articulated. Once the incompleteness of the past in its revolutionary possibility has become visible, the task is to accomplish them. As Massimiliano Tomba writes, it is about working with the roads not taken or repressed, which, from the past, can shed light on the possibility that were left unfinished but remain vital to reimagine our present. The only possible way to do justice to the leftover of history, to vindicate them, is to make use of them, that is, to actualize them. Actualization is the authentic historical comprehension insofar as it gives an afterlife to the historical object. Historical materialism conceive historical understanding as an afterlife of that which has been understood and whose pulse can be felt in the present, writes Benjamin. Afterlife, Nachleben, is precisely the concept of which Benjamin serves in his essays Der Aufgabe des Übersetzers in order to indicate the reorigination of the work of art in his translations. Actualizing the past, therefore, means to give it an afterlife, a new life, by turning it into a new origin, the point out of which a different present can spring out, diverting the course of history. Only as such is the past actual in the sense of the German word wirklich. It can produce effects in history. The generation of the downtrodden are vindicated and redeemed because the new order they tried to bring about and for which they succumbed is kept alive, the baton now consigned to the present struggling generation. It is this the secret agreement between the past generations and the present one of which Benjamin speaks in the second thesis. And if capitalism is a religion which turns the practice of market and the progress to be achieved into cult, so Benjamin's demystification is the desacralization of this cult. History is made profane again, that is, it is returned to a dimension of which human beings can dispose. That is to say, history is returned to the agency of the subaltern classes. And another quotation that was already taken up this morning, the subject of historical knowledge is the struggling oppressed class itself. Marx presents it as the last enslaved class, the avenger that completes the task of liberation in the name of the generation of the downtrodden. As such, it is the subject of historical knowledge and of historical construction, because history is understood as construction. From this point of view, the state of dream is dissolved also in another sense. Benjamin always plays on the ambiguity of dream. The state of unconsciousness regards both the illusion of the eternal law of capital and the hope for happiness and emancipation. The latter, however, only appears as a wish image or an utopia, which is sought in the present only by conforming to induced consumption. Demystifying the myth, thus, also produces the effect of creating a possible place for that utopia, thus dismissing it as utopia and turning it into reality. In this sense, dissolving the state of dream is also realizing the hidden dream, turning it into the conscious construction of a new society. In this sense, I think Michael Slovis' reading of Benjamin's political thought as romantic anarchism or a revolutionary use of nostalgia for the past may be misleading. Well, I'm not arguing anything against Michael Slovis' reading, but it's just to focus on the terms he uses. Thus successfully showing that Benjamin's backward gaze does not aim to a return to the past, but it is projected towards a world to come, and it is a detour through the past on the way of a utopian future. The use of terms like nostalgia or utopia does not seem to do justice to Benjamin's point. Nostalgia would imply the missing of something which we once experienced and which we later lost, and it describes the longing for that moment and the will to have it back. This risks to lead precisely to the creation of the myth of an original past whose essence should be reestablished. Yet another narrative. Utopia, on its turn, casts the goal of emancipation into a non-place, undefined future because of the impossibility to have it realized in the present world. Quite the opposite for Benjamin, utopia is the form which the revolution takes in the state of dream. Once consciousness is awake, revolution is not to postpone but to be enacted here and now. As he says, every second is the smallest gateway in time through which the Messiah might enter. So his message is not as a hope in a future to come, but a call to action. So, and I go to the conclusion. Benjamin does offer a concept of history which allows to meet the challenge of subaltern studies. reworking of Gramsci, to think of the vindication of the past as a condition for the emancipation of the subaltern classes. The problem by subaltern studies is that, when articulating the reappropriation of this past, they show unable to take distance from the nationalist model. Though denouncing its elitist character, in the end, they still share Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay's plea for an Indian historiography of India, written by an imprecise Indian people, a project which excludes all non-Hindus and which is realized by Bankim Chandra's own writing of history, and they still support strategic nationalism. They are well aware that this will not lead to the emancipation of the subaltern classes, and that will rather reproduce relations of subordination, but I cannot imagine an alternative. We are therefore provided with yet another narrative, which is, however, yet another myth. The aura of an original past, the greatness of the Indian people, whose worth should be reestablished against the colonizers. Benjamin's challenge is instead to get out of the logic of production of myth, both from that of the colonizing capital and of the ideologies which would reproduce subordination under other forms. Emancipating history from myth is thus condition for the emancipation of the classes kept subaltern by that myth. Giving them back the capacity of action requires the destruction of the aura of the original past that once was, and the affirmation of the possibility of giving origin to what never was. It is not about producing other myths, other narratives, a multiplicity of histories, but about changing the course of the one catastrophic history we have. It must be admitted, however, that Benjamin's concept of history is not yet a program for the emancipation of the subaltern classes. He develops a theory of awakening to class consciousness, not a theory of organization, nor a model for the reorganization. A gap remains between the awakening and the formation of a collective political subject, and between the knowability of the past and the political action, of course. After the communist turn, he repeatedly calls for a constructive moment so that the historical force of the oppressed class does not go lost in nihilist destruction. However, it does not provide himself a theory of such reorganization, and it is not even its question. However, he deals with the question of what concept of history we need, what we have to reject and what instead we have to assume, and with which implications, to think of a history of the subaltern classes as a constructing themselves as a collective political subject. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Giulia. So, who starts with the questions and comments?
Thank you. Can we also turn on the light? I feel we are a bit in the dark. Yeah. No, thank you. It was incredibly dense, like also the chapter that I read. So, now I don't know how to frame it because I didn't have time to think about it. But let's say if the argument is that Benjamin can help where the subalternists are failing. So precisely in the attempt of vindicating the subalterns, you seem to say that what is needed is a different framework for conceptualizing history. But in the sort of, critical points that you outline in relation to the subalternists, it seems that it was not so much the conception of history that was problematic, or maybe it was, but a bit on the background. And then the points that you mentioned were mostly related to the very functional role of the intellectuals. So basically the subaltern is not being organic intellectual, but then I'm wondering, would you qualify them as traditional intellectuals, or traditional that didn't break with the with the ruling class to which they belong? I'm not sure we can make this argument, but I follow you when you say they are not organic intellectuals. I mean, but so what I'm trying to say is that it seems that the problem is history, but then it seems to me, and according to what you say, that the problem comes. The problem is in relation to the role of the intellectuals. So, what kind of intellectual are the subalternists in relation to subaltern classes? but also the understand, I mean, there is also an issue of class, because you were mentioning that somehow there are several shifts and level of conflation where subaltern classing then may be the people. And then the people, the colonized as the people, may be prey of a sort of falling into nationalism rather than maintaining some sort of class divide that could allow the expression of a subjectivity which is not only opposing the colonial rule, but also opposing the national bourgeoisie or the nationalist problem, right? So here there is another dimension, which is this class dimension that you highlighted. I mean, maybe I didn't reconstruct it properly, but there was something about it. And then I couldn't see how Benjamin could also help here. Probably could, but I didn't have the impression that you follow up on this. And then another line, yes, I mean, it was still connected to this idea of nationalism. I'm wondering whether you think that Benjamin intervened or can provide some sort of pharmacon in connection to this topic of nationalism. I was thinking about Fanon, because in Fanon you have on the pitfalls of national consciousness, really this understanding that there's, I mean, the very notion of nationalism, or it's a slippery. So the people moved by the nationalist ideology may also fall prey of the bourgeois nationalism. So per se, nationalism is not, again, this neutral positive category, no matter the fact that anti-colonial struggle embraced anti-colonial nationalism. But then, I mean, this is, again, not just something set in stone. Like, the anti-colonial nationalism can evolve and can be more or less influenced by its bourgeois component, so to say. So I'm wondering how also Benjamin could be useful on that level. So just to simplify, if Benjamin is the solution to the problem that the subalternists didn't solve, or that they attempt to solve but they didn't manage to vindicate the subaltern, how can Benjamin respond to this level? Because I follow you on how a different conception of history is needed and why Benjamin can provide that. But how can Benjamin respond to this? I mean, not that we have necessarily to look at Benjamin. I was thinking that other authors can be mobilized to that extent. The other thing is, I'm curious to know if, for example, I mean, the reception of the subalternists, there's a lot. So and one of the most polemic interventions was the one by Vivek Chiber criticizing what he calls post-colonialist theory, but basically going back to Giulia and Patergy. And it's this idea that they get it deeply wrong in their understanding of the role that the bourgeoisie play in the colonial context. So the very thesis of dominance without hegemony is for Chiber bullshit. And I'm wondering if in your critique there's also something coming from that side or not at all. So if you're also contesting Giulia's understanding of the role of let's say the elite in the colonial context, or if you're actually not discussing that aspect. Does it make sense? Sorry, there was a lot.
No, thank you. So, firstly, the role of the intellectual. Well, no, I don't think that subalternists can be classified as what Gramsci would call traditional intellectual. Is not that, but they don't take radically the role of organic. What does it mean to be organic intellectual? I tend to take the word seriously, so to speak. So organic means that they are an organ of, so an instrument for the class. So they have to serve for the class on raising to consciousness. They don't have a role of representing or speaking for the class. They are an instrument for the class to evolve as a political subject, and Gramsci is very clear about this point. I think when he characterizes the role of the organic intellectuals within the democratic centralism, quasi as a syllogism, because he says it is like at the end like a movement from the basis of the class to a new basis of the class endowed with revolutionary capacity through the critical role of the intellectuals, which is totally internal to for the class and almost vanishes at the end. It is not what it is represented, but what it vanishes at like the middle term in the syllogism. So it's that the point they missed, that they seem to be still anchored to a view of representative or speaking for someone who is not able to speak. The problem is letting them speak. For the first question. The second point, how can Benjamin help? Well, I don't think Benjamin can provide an answer in the sense that we cannot articulate with only Benjamin an answer to strategical nationalism. It's not that the point, but this process of demystification helps to prevent that another narrative imposes itself as a myth. In this sense, it has a negative critical role against the building of new mythology.
Nationalism.
Yes. And with regard to Guam, well, I read the book several times because I was convinced I did not understand it, because I cannot understand how, on the one hand, he perfectly seems to understand the logic of the elite program, which leads to passive revolution in a way in the Indian country, but on the other way, he still proposes this agenda of the own writing of history, which, okay, it is good, I'm not contesting that, but it does not take distance from this, from how the project was developed in the end by Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay. It is the last chapter, and it seems to be detached from the critique to the elite production of the...
Just want to clarify this to you, what you're saying. You mean, you think Gu on the one hand is criticizing the nationalist elite, but at the same time, the whole subalternist project is not necessarily distancing itself from that same...
Yes, and my point, at least the way I can understand it, is that his criticism is not so deep in the very concept of history that he cannot provide an alternative solution to that. And that's why, in a way, it falls back to the same model.
Giulia, thank you so much for your talk. It was I really enjoyed it. So I had two sort of points and questions. So when you, I would definitely, I completely followed your point that there's a fundamental flaw with the way in which subaltern studies in the first period set itself up, because they, not consciously, but that shifting of colonized subject with Indian elites, that sort of collapse of those two groups certainly happened. Personally, I don't think that the subaltern studies historians did that themselves. That happened in later usage, and especially when subaltern studies sort of became part of post-colonial studies, and it became a bit more popularized, and basically also shifts discipline, because it goes from history to literature, to cultural studies, to anthropology. And the main issue that I think, a very, very good critique that has been made of that group, and that the inability to see the sort of disorganic nature of the intellectual is caste, right? So caste is this massive, it creates elites in India, and you cannot understand how class works in India if you don't take into consideration its intersections with caste. And those are very complex interactions. However, I don't know if the account that you're giving of Benjamin is really interesting to me, in terms of how you say he sort of is trying to demythicize the natural form of history, that he's trying to show how the history of capitalism is not inevitable, it's not the progress of mankind, it's something that has to be demythicized, you have to take a step back. I think that within the second, the questioning of the nationalist basis of subaltern studies does happen within that same school of thought, right? So when Spivak writes her essay,
Yes.
when she literally asks, can the subaltern speak, she's basically formulating a version of the criticism that you're making, that she says, well, you have not questioned the representativeness of you as a historian to speak for the subaltern. And we were, in the earlier session, we were thinking about the ways in which sometimes subalterns do not speak, but they act, right? So the act of a subaltern forms history to some extent. So she has this example of a young Indian woman who, by certain actions that she takes, makes a historical intervention. And though she never, obviously there's no written record. So that, I think, is one point. But the question of demythicizing history and what the project was about, I think, is very much exemplified in Chakrabarti. So I guess, like, alongside Guha, you also have someone like Dipesh Chakrabarti, who is saying very similar things. He's saying, we need to think of, like, what kind of history do we want? And questioning that notion of history is important, right? So history is, of course, it's a colonial construct. And he has that famous example of thinking about the word water and pani, and how H2O becomes a sort of meta language in which you describe both terms. And in that sense, then, the writing of history, he says, and he's referring even to those earlier subaltern studies historians, was trying to create a meta language, right? So you're trying to write a sort of secular form of the Indian past. So he's trying to replace that word history with the word past. He's saying there are other versions of the past that we need to recover in order to restore the kind of history that you were talking about, the actual history, the one that can produce an effect, the one where you're taking into consideration not just historical writing, which is, of course, again, it's a colonial inheritance in that sense. So, probably I'm not being very, very, very clear here, but it is exactly that, of taking a step back and seeing how you must not reify any myth into nature. You're saying history should not reify any myth into nature. And Chakrabarti is saying, let's look objectively at the language that history produces. It's a meta language, and it doesn't recognize itself as such, right? So when you write a secular history of India, if you're using only secularist instruments, you are actually not seeing how you are constructing a meta language about that region. That you need to take into consideration other forms of preserving the past, obviously like mythology, obviously like religious narratives. So I think that the critique is really just, but I think that within the Subaltern Studies group itself, there were a lot of discussions and contradictions about this, and Chakrabarti has a lot to teach us. And the last thing that I was thinking was about this question of East and West, because that is something that it becomes very binary, right? So it's either East or it's either West. But at the same time, there is a linguistic distinction, right? So that narratives in past written in Indian languages they do follow a different trajectory from narratives written in English. And it's not an essential difference, but it is a linguistic one. So again, Chakrabarti is inviting us to think about that diversity of languages when he's saying pani is not equivalent to water. It's not. And it's not subsumable into the third term, which is H2O. I think that's what he's trying to question, right? So he's saying H2 is not some sort of universal language into which we can understand the past. Those are some thoughts I had.
No, thank you for the suggestions, and I'll try to comment on that. So, first of all, I agree that there is a lot of discussion within the project of Subaltern Study itself, and also its different generations, if we want, because it's not always Gua, it's not always Chatterjee. And of course, after that, the comments of Spivak, the discussion evolved a lot. My problem with that turn brought about by Spivak is that it would lead to no political possibility in a way, if not in a strategical way, like strategical essentialism and so. So I agree with the criticism, but then I see no solution. If we take that road, we cannot construct hegemony in that way. Okay, first point. Second point that makes me remind that I did not reply your question about national. Yes, I mean, of course, the struggle for independence as a role. I'm not undermining that, and if, as in the example you were bringing, it has then an universalizing impulse, so to speak. For example, Fanon, but okay, maybe it's not the best example, but I am always thinking the Zapatismo. It starts as a local struggle, and the SLN as N nationalism in its name, but it's not because they wanted another nation state as such in that form that they are strongly criticizing, but from a local offense, a local injustice, they try to construct a universal emancipation. And if nationalism plays a role in that, it is something. But I was talking about nationalism as the ideology which seeks independence for the construction of a nation state, which is something else, I think. Not that the local does not have its right. Of course, the local struggle for independence has its right. And with regard to Chakrabarty, yes, I agree, and it is the closest within the Subaltern Studies I see to Benjamin. I think it still remains the problem of how to think the subaltern histories of which he speaks, because he also says that there is indeed no way out from the main history, so to speak. There are also this subaltern history struggling as a point to criticize the main paradigm and to work with a critical attitude, but they do not give life to something really new. There are only critical remarks on a linear course in a way, but at least this is the impression I have with Chakrabarty. And with regard to the last point, the distinction east to west. Yes, of course, there are different traditions and different ways to conceive history also, and they have to be taken into account. But the point made by Chatterjee, I think it is another one, when he speaks about strategic nationalism, because he talks about the argument made by the leading elite of these movements, that since Western countries had the possibility to build their own state, realizing their Western essence, so Eastern people can claim their rights to do the same, but expressing an Eastern essence which is different, not in the form, but in the spirit, not in the material realm, but in the spiritual realm. And I think this is exactly, yes, like making a fetish of what is the cultural difference that you were talking about. So the different traditions that have to be taken into account and valued.
I mean, I think he was describing more what they thought they were doing, I think. So my reading of Chakrabarty is always, Chatterjee, when he distinguishes between the spiritual realm and the public domain, the public domain and the private domain, is that he was saying this is how the nationalists themselves constructed difference, rather than saying that this is how it was. I mean, that was my reading. So, that Chatterjee was describing a historical process of how Indian nationalist elites were constructing their own difference from the colonizer. I didn't read it as him positing that essentialist difference.
Okay, but then at the end of the book, he doesn't propose anything else. So
Yeah. Sorry.
Yes, now what you just said, and I think now I would rephrase also my question, but maybe I go back to Jamila's point regarding the critique of subaltern studies that was raised by the controversial book by Giulia. So in the end, the argument would be not so much about the role of the intellectual, and maybe not so much, or let's put it this way, that the national bourgeoisie becomes then the point where empty homogeneous time of culture, law, culture, treasury, and so on is reinserted into anti-colonial struggle. This would be an epiphenomenon of the problem that in terms of the victorious course of world capitalism as a global system, what Chakrabarty would still call history 1 versus history 2, that the very distinction is internal to capital and not a Western myth of false universality that would not account for history 2. Sadly, what we know is that the mediation between history 1 and 2 is what makes capitalism such a powerful relation, that where Benjamin has just to add, it will not die a natural death or catastrophe, whatever. Because all the points could also be made with Marx about the contingency, the class relation, and we could even do a montage of Benjamin Marx. The only thing we would say is that the teleological direction towards world revolution isn't there. And always après coup, in the ex post teleology would say all other histories become part of the history of capitalism. And for me, this really makes me think, what is to gain from, is also my question. What do we gain in discussions about, let's call it a revolutionary concept of history, when world capitalism has evacuated this battle, also in ideology, is not interested in history. You can have your histories, you can have what you want, you can have representation of what you want. I can deal with heterogeneity and diversity. It's what fuels my value production thing. And also I go to space sterilization, to bring in Frederick Jameson's argument vis-a-vis singularity. It's not anymore about, these are debates of the 80s and 90s. What do we do with this? After the victory of capitalism as a global system? Or are we still in the 80s and disavow the world historical triumph of capitalism? I hope we are wrong, but we will be victorious. But we have first to say it won.
Well, this is just a comment. I don't know if I have to.
I mean, my point is, well, Benjamin goes beyond Marx then. Where Benjamin goes beyond?
Marx.
Minus what I said, what he, where we agree on, no? It's fine.
But I didn't understand something. So, I mean, the reading was like, somehow, no matter how controversial or some really wrong elements Chiber has, he may have a point in saying maybe not be relevant to play history 2 against history 1, because anyway, this is not what makes the difference. Capitalism can accommodate a multiplicity of histories. This is what you were saying. Okay, that's what you were saying. No, sorry, I feel dumb because every time I have to summarize to make sure that I got it right. No, it's a cognitive limit.
History 2 exists.
Yeah.
But now as eternal, reproduced by capitalism.
Yeah, yes. But this is... Okay. No. No, I don't think it's... No. Okay, so I think that in Chakrabarty also the idea that history 2 is external to capital, to history 1 is not true. Like there is this sort of interruption from within. So there's no outside of capitalist. this distinction between history 1 and history 2 that Chakrabarty develops does not make history 2 some sort of external, irreducible, obscure otherness.
But nevertheless heterogeneous.
It's heterogeneous, but it's also understood as a sort of internal interruption. Just because I don't think that Chakrabarty is producing this idea of there is an out. This would be for me the decolonial mood, the idea that there is this external otherness which is necessarily can be used as a lever against, colonial modernity or colonial capitalism. There is an element, where you were saying, there is an element of heterogeneity that does not allow to necessarily find easy translation or easy analogies, but it's not out of capitalism. It's in the fact that there are different historical formation, cultural formation, economic formation. This does not mean that they exist outside of capitalism, let alone against capitalism per se. Like, it's not an essentialist argument about history too. But what I'm trying to say is that I may agree paradoxically with Cheeber's idea that capitalism, which is the argument of political Marxists, usually is like capitalism is this universalist homogenizing drive. It doesn't give a shit about whether you're a man or a woman, whether there's patriarchy or not patriarchy, whether you have your cultural difference, because capitalism would be able to subsume in any way, accommodate everything, and use it as a fuel for its own expansion. And I may take it seriously, and I do believe that it may be the case. The argument that I would have against Cheeber and against political Marxists in general is that capitalism as we know it, in the argument, like capitalism doesn't need patriarchy, for example. Capitalism as we know it rely on patriarchy. Or capitalism as we know it relied on colonialism. So we cannot, if we don't have just to work in terms of science fiction, could we conceive of a non-patriarchal capitalism or a non-racial capitalism? Maybe, but the one we know so historically, it's what it is. And this is why we have to deal with reality somehow. The other thing, because it sounds to me as a more of a logical objection, right? So when Cheeber says capitalism can accommodate everything, yes, but then let's look at what is actually now accommodating. And let's try to understand how this functions. And then the counter-argument could be, indeed, but this shows that cultural difference per se is not an element of antagonism. And I agree with that. I do believe that even, we can think of pre-modern cultural formation, economic formation. They are not necessarily anti-capitalist for being not orthodoxically capitalist. This doesn't make them anti-capitalist. So I understand the Marxist critique of saying, hey, it's not that cultural difference per se represent an enemy or an antagonist force against capitalism. But what I find extremely problematic with Cheeber, I don't think it's just racism. It's just then you don't explain the difference between. I think that was one of the critique that was brought up by I don't remember the other. Look at my memory. But the idea that you have to be able to explain the capitalism of Rana Plaza and the capitalism of the Ruhr. So you cannot simply say that there is this one capitalism, because you have to look at the concrete form that capitalism shapes and how it takes shapes in different contexts. And this is where, without essentializing the coloniality of power, not that I have to make a caricature of the decolonial, but one can think of how, and I think we agree on that, those different processes of making capitalists at home is shaped differently in different contexts. And this is a problem that Cheeber seems just to dismiss. So by dismissing history too, it dismisses all sort of difference, not just the problem that you have when difference becomes a sort of essence that is used as a lever against, and it's not, but also the possibility of giving account of the different shapes that capitalists take.
He dismisses it, and that's his failure.
But I think it's not that we have to fake him.
That's why he fails. Exactly.
But Jamil, I don't know if, I agree with you completely, but I don't know whether it's just about being essentialist and saying, oh, this is anti-capitalist. It's also by giving giving a genealogy to capitalism, right? The title of the book is Provincializing Europe. So he's saying, look, capitalism is a local phenomenon that became global, but it's very much located in the historical, political, material conditions of Europe, in whatever, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries with colonialism and slavery. So he's giving a genealogy to capitalism, which it didn't, of course, it's had it.
The genealogy of capitalism, in the sense that the origin is clearly not, one could think that there was a global history there, because primitive accumulation, of course, works on. Sorry, I didn't want to drop it, but
No, sure.
wider scale.
The microphone.
No, really, go ahead.
But I suppose what he's saying, though, that even anti-capitalism needs to be provincialized, right? And I think that was the criticism that so many black Marxists had with the Comintern in the 1930s. It was the same. Like C.L.R. James, there were so many of them who just were anti-Comintern and anti-Euro-Marxism, because the criticism is not just that capitalism is Western, but also that forms of anti-capitalism imposed upon, third world struggles becomes a form of Eurocentrism in its own right. That you have to provincialize the entire thing, in a way.
No, it's one. It means that it worked. I mean,
we were having a round table any case, so I think we just have to right now have some closure from your talk, and then
there's a round table.
And then there's a round table.
No, I don't know.
Do you have any replies? To
No.
this? Okay. So yeah. But in any case, I think we should take up.
Yes.
More or less soon.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thank
again,
you.
Giulia.